Good morning. Welcome to our November meeting of Seniors for Peace. We have an excellent program that I saw at least part of, or most of maybe, whatever, when I invited Katy to come and talk about the history of the Peace Studies program at Manchester College/University. And so I'm here to introduce her. Is there anyone here who does not know Katy Gray Brown? Okay, well, that's what I thought. She's been here many times, and we always like her programs, and so they're always very informative. And so let's welcome Dr. Brown.
Thank you. And this feels just like class. I have 2 rows of empty seats in the front. It's a joy to be here today. When I was asked to speak today, I was asked to do a representation of something that many of you might have seen in the spring at the Shepherd Center. I presented there about the history of peace studies during our 75th anniversary year. And the request was that I show that again. Although now we're a little older, right? And things have changed since, I'm trying to remember when it was, if it was April that I was at the Shepherd Center. You may remind me of that. So I will start out with some of the same slides, just to give you, so we're all on the same ground. And then we can take it from there, because we're older and things have changed. But I have to start the history of peace studies with the history of the Church of the Brethren, because this is a distinctly Brethren project. I have a colleague from Kent State who was director of the program there in conflict management. And he was an old Catholic worker from that tradition. And he said, peace studies would not exist without the Church of the Brethren. And I was really struck by that. This is a leader of one of the most prestigious programs, graduate programs in the country, the Center at Kent State. And his understanding was that peace studies was so informed by the Church of the Brethren tradition that it would not exist, certainly not as it does, without that beginning. And so I start with this understanding that this was like a distinctly Brethren project that we are talking about here, because of how it started and because of how it developed, really for the first decades. And that begins then with Otho Winger, right? Who was president of Manchester from 1911 to 1941. He was a graduate of Manchester. And before he came to study at Manchester, he had a break in his schooling for 2 years during which he taught at the Miami Indian School here in the southeastern corner of the county. Some of you may have traveled with us to the Miami Indian School a few years ago. But because of that time, and because he grew up with Miami friends, he brought this desire to maintain tribal connections with, personal connections, but also to establish them better with the university, with Manchester College at that time. And that's a project then that our Peace Studies program is continuing today. We've tried to revisit and sort of invest in that connection with the Miami community. And Winger was president of Manchester when the Board of Christian Education gave a report to annual conference that expressed a desire for each of the brethren institutions to hold as an emphasis a special study to certain phases of Christian living. And you know that's how they phrased it, because I wouldn't phrase it like that. But they said each college should have a special study to certain phases of Christian living. And the phase that they assigned to Manchester was the peace witness of Christian living. So this came in Winger's time, and there was a discussion, consideration about what that might look like. But then there was this period in which there wasn't a specific action taken on it until the presidency of Vernon Schwalm. President from 1941 to 1956. And he took this charge seriously and started a conversation amongst faculty, but it didn't move anywhere until a graduate, Dan West, who at this point was well into work with Heifer Project, a 1917 graduate of Manchester, I believe. And he offered to come to Manchester for one semester to lead a seminar called The Bases of Enduring Peace. That was, I believe, spring of 1947. And he would travel back and forth from the Heifer headquarters to Manchester's campus. And you can see how rough times were at Manchester. Students didn't even have chairs. But they packed into his lecture, and part of this was the appeal of Dan West. You know, that such a powerful figure, so inspirational, and that he would set aside time from his work at Heifer and from laying the groundwork among young people in the United States for the movement that would become BVS. He thought it was important enough to have a space at Manchester to talk about what happened during World War II and what we need to do, that there should be that space in this seminar. Tremendously popular. Someone who heard about this seminar was Gladys Muir, a professor at Laverne College, California, and a Brethren historian who, because my roots are also in Kansas, I have to say she was from Kansas, right? A McPherson College graduate. But Gladys Muir corresponded with Dan West, connected with him to learn about this seminar, and she took the thinking and the work that she had been doing at Laverne in raising international consciousness, and paired with some of her reflections on what Dan West was doing at Manchester. And in the summer of 1947, she wrote a paper, and I have a copy of it here. The place of the Brethren Colleges in preparing men and women for peace leadership. Perhaps some of you have read this paper. We have a copy online in our digital archives. But it's a beautiful expression of the mismatch between the technological advances of the 20th century and a stagnation of the necessary moral advances, spiritual advances, to keep those technological changes in check, right? And her vision for the Brethren colleges is that we could double down on philosophy and religious studies in order to equip people to become leaders in this new world in which the capacities for destruction have been made so apparent. Vernon Schwalm read the paper and said, this is the person who needs to come. Now, part of that was inspired by the brilliance of Gladys Muir's paper. Part of that was probably inspired by Dan West's refusal to come back for another semester of teaching the bases for enduring peace. So he was short faculty to continue this program. And West said, no, Manchester needs to do this, right? There needs to be institutional support for this. So because Gladys Muir was not released from her contract at Laverne, a collaboration of faculty continued this peace studies curriculum, this nascent seminar, for the year 47 to 48. And in 1948, Gladys Muir was released from her contract at Laverne, grudgingly, I should say. This is one of those brethren conflict stories between the presidents of the college, because somehow Vernon Schwalm was able to lure Gladys Muir and her family, her mother who came with her, to Indiana with the promise to start a new Department of Peace Education, Department of Peace Studies. Now, once she got here, I don't know if it was a bait and switch. It didn't actually become a department. It became an interdisciplinary program. But it had its own curriculum. It was a major, a standalone major. And Muir was authorized to develop the kind of collaboration among colleagues to pick courses from across the curriculum and develop new ones that would provide a foundation for people who were studying, for the first time ever, peace studies. A new major, a new field, just like that. This is what she did. This is the original curriculum for the Bachelor of Arts degree in Peace Studies. A full year of communications, which was in the English department. It was more of the traditional understanding of grammar, right? Being language and rhetoric. So a year of communications, a year of history, a year of biology, foreign language, PE, which she recommended folk games as the PE course that people would take. Second year, literature, art, psychology, religion, geology, geography. And third year, history, economics, ethics, sociology, psychology. Now, during this period, more broadly, most students took a common curriculum their first and second years. Is that right? People may know this firsthand. There was more of a culture of common curriculum those first and second years, and then in your third and fourth years came the electives that allowed you to specialize in your discipline. And famous, I almost said notorious, was Gladys Muir's readings seminar, which was a senior year seminar in which I have read the curriculum, sometimes 300 pages a week. Students were required to read books upon books upon books that reflected what she believed was the canon that people needed to know in order to, always with that eye to a moral and spiritual development, for analyzing conflict, identifying the factors that contribute to conflict, and then imagining nonviolent resolution, nonviolent alternatives to those conflicts. This is the Manchester mission statement. I won't go into it. Most of you are very familiar with this. But our Peace Studies program has its own articulation of our mission. The Peace Studies program graduates persons with a critical understanding of the causes and consequences of violence and injustice, equipped with both theoretical and practical knowledge of nonviolent ways of resolving conflict and promoting justice. Peace Studies prepares our graduates to be capable, confident, and courageous in the work of building a peaceful and just world. Our curriculum looks a little different now than the curriculum of 1950 or 1949. We now have a survey course that serves many first-year students, not just those in peace studies. A mediation course that also works to serve people in psychology, in a new pre-ministerial program that we are developing. Also a graduate level negotiations course for the College of Business that will be launched in the spring. And here are the staff of the program. Kate Eisenbeis-Krell, who teaches religions and war. She's a professor in religious studies in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. Dr. Anuj Gurung, who is the Gladys Muir Endowed Professor. His work is entirely in mediation and conflict resolution in the Peace Studies program. He also is a specialist in questions of migration and immigration. He is originally from Nepal. And we are working together to propose a January session trip to Nepal next year, which is very exciting. And then Libby Krebs is currently the Peace Studies Coordinator, which is a full-time staff position. It's a graduate internship, really, for someone who has recently graduated from the program to help us with our capacity building activities and to work with students as they pursue projects that they care about. And Peace Studies isn't just at Manchester anymore. The numbers are shifting because what we've seen in the last, in changes in higher education in the last 5 to 10 years, many programs that had started are now either being closed or being integrated into other programs. So there are not as many standalone peace and conflict studies programs as there were 15 years ago. However, there are more than 190 programs from the certificate level to the PhD level that are somehow connected to peace and conflict studies. And Manchester is the mother program for many of these. Like directly a mother program, programs that wrote to Manchester to ask how we did it here, or what our curriculum has involved, or what kinds of resources we might recommend as they start our program. But for all of them, though, I mean, Manchester is so clearly the predecessor. I think for more than 20 years, this was the only place in the world that had a peace studies program. And over those 20 years, already our curriculum was changing and adapting given what we were seeing in the world. And that's work that we continue to do. This map has been very useful. It's a depiction of what people do with peace studies majors. It was developed by John Paul Lederach at the University of Notre Dame, who's at University of Notre Dame and Eastern Mennonite University. But you can see the directions that peace studies can lead is diverse. Right? And that has really required us to continue to be very interdisciplinary, to be very flexible, to identify just what is the heart of understanding questions of violence and methods of nonviolence, and how can those tools be used in all of these different areas. Peace studies programs have some sort of connection to this common understanding of the field, but there are pieces of Manchester's program that continue to be distinctive. I had a sabbatical project 10 years ago, 10 years ago, in which I explored other peace studies programs to think about what sorts of directions Manchester might go with our program. And as I visited programs around the country, I developed, as one does when one leaves home, a deeper appreciation for some of the strengths that we have. Something that is distinctive is the community that we have built and continued to nurture, and the focus on experiential education. Gladys Muir started out with this, with her tea dates, right? She would invite students to have tea and discuss current issues. And that morphed into larger gatherings in the 1960s. And we have held a weekly meeting under different names since 1963, when it started as a philosophy coffee house. And then in the 1970s took the name Kinapoko Moko Coalition, the Kinapoko Moko Peace Coalition. So that meets still regularly, gathering between 12 and 25 students over popcorn and tea to discuss world events, to host different guest speakers, and to learn from each other. So it's a really, really important peer education space that we hold. Part of our priority on experiential education involves leaving North Manchester. And this too is a tradition that Gladys Muir started by taking students to different conferences or to hear different speakers. We have organized students to present at national peace conferences. Here you see a group of students that presented at the Kroc Institute's undergraduate peace research conference at Notre Dame. And a group that presented at the Peace and Justice Studies Association conference in Iowa a year ago. And on the left, we have a picture of field experience that we organize for students and alumni to learn about Miami history locally. So an elder in the Miami and another tribal council member led us on a tour of different spots in Miami County that have these ties, and we were able to learn from them about both their tribal history, but also current struggles that the Miami community is facing. And here we have a sampling of our January term travel courses. We've had 44 trips since 1971, domestic and abroad, 25 different countries, from Kenya to Cuba, excuse me, Ireland, Nicaragua, Colombia, Costa Rica, the Bahamas, and domestically. We've led trips on civil rights tours, trips that looked at immigration and the circumstances, the conditions of maquiladores along the Texas-Mexico border, and some really fun trips visiting intentional communities and communes. If you want to hear about those stories, I'm happy to tell you off mic. And a Brother and Heritage trip that we collaborated with the Department of Religious Studies and Philosophy for. These are some of the pictures from those trips. And these are remarkable and transformative trips. Many of our students have not left the country before. Some of them have never been on a plane before. When we went to Kenya in January, 2 of our students had never been on a plane. And I think twice that number had never been out of the country. So it really allows us to expand our understanding of peace building and the skills that we bring to this work. A word about confronting new challenges. Some of the new directions that we are taking in the program with recent years, we launched a poverty studies initiative that includes an academic course devoted to looking at issues of poverty, poverty in Wabash County and poverty internationally. And we're able to bring in speakers to tell us about the different conditions that our neighbors face. Earlier this week, Jim Geyer came to speak about the housing action for Wabash County, to really put a face on how people are experiencing homelessness in our own neighborhoods. We have a renewed commitment to philosophy and religious studies as different areas of emphasis and different curricular changes hit Manchester. We recognize that it's important to support programs that might have a diminished profile in the overall institutional landscape, right? And as more and more students come for pre-professional programs, interested in business programs or health science programs or programs that lead directly to a degree, right? And all of this is because of economic pressures. We find fewer and fewer students who imagine themselves as a philosophy major or a religious studies major. When we combine that with changes that have resulted in an absent position with respect to the campus pastor, Peace Studies and the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies have partnered to maintain religious life activities and to imagine more and more spaces, whether that's through the Values, Ideas, and Arts Monday Convocation program or activities such as Focus on Faith Week, which we just completed, places where we can push to attention the resources that philosophy and religious studies brings to persons of any field, right? Both in terms of personal growth, but also in terms of how we navigate the diverse world that we are in with the tools of philosophy and religious studies. We have now for 4 years a collaboration with environmental studies that has been a joy. We found that students in environmental studies and students in peace studies were asking some of the same questions. We're concerned about the same issues with climate change and climate insecurity, but we were coming about it from very different ways, and we need each other in order to be effective in our communities. So we've launched a garden space, a teaching garden that's just down the street, a WASP project, which has gotten lots of attention, even here on Timbercrest campus too. And other initiatives to really support the work of these two interdisciplinary programs at Manchester. Peace Studies provides leadership with the Values, Ideas, and Arts program. We now sponsor between 8 and 15 speakers a year for that lecture series. And we see it as an important way, not just to raise questions of social justice for our students, but for everyone in the North Manchester community, because that convocation hour is such an important resource. And finally, we're establishing more and more with community partners, whether that be education for conflict resolution, whether that be our neighbors at Joyfield Farm, the Kindy and Gross community that has housed some of our summer interns, or with our friends at Seniors for Peace or the Shepherd Center, just because there are so many important places that we need to be asking these questions about the world and our place in it. Okay. One slide about what's happening next. And you will get all of this information in different forms. But we took a beat a couple weeks ago and have had lots of discussions about what might happen next and understanding where we are in the world as a country, as a campus community. But we already have a slate of activities in the works for the spring. And I just wanted to put this up to demonstrate how far in advance we try to plan programs and opportunities for engagement around these issues. One in particular, we have 2 international peacemakers coming, and part of that commitment is because it's been more difficult to bring international students to Manchester. Peace Studies decided we need to have more of a commitment to bringing international people here. So we have a Kenyan peace builder whose area of emphasis is on theater and storytelling. He will be visiting in February. And a South African human rights worker and peace builder who is coming in April as part of our Peace Week activities. And then in April, also, we have a performance by Michael Mears. Some of you may have seen his one act about Bertrand Russell as a conscientious objector a few years ago. But he will be performing a play called The Mistake, which is about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that will be in early April. But we welcome suggestions. Our hope is to constantly be developing this program to enliven our understanding of the world and our imagination of how we can be working for the betterment of it. Something that I want to mention here too, this mention of Bethany connections. We'll be bringing Steve Schweitzer from Bethany to give a presentation on theology and science fiction. It's part of our commitment to every year bringing someone from Bethany to speak to Manchester students. And we've made a commitment every year to take a group of students to Bethany. Let's see. On the left, that's a group. We took a group to Bethany to see the solar eclipse in the spring, and to do a service project with the Bethany Bowl program. The Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies has forged an agreement so that our students may take Bethany courses and work on towards a completion of a Bethany certificate while they are still Manchester students. Our hope is that it will encourage a new group of leaders from Manchester to continue at Bethany, because we are so impressed with the directions that Bethany has taken with the Bethany Bowl program in particular. So this is another example of a partnership that we are holding in great care right now. It's thinking about our place back at the beginning within the Church of the Brethren, and how we can continue that particular connection. It's so clear now, right? We've been having lots of conversations about hope. And one of our answers about hope is that pacifists have a kind of an edge here right now, because being a pacifist through the 20th century and 21st century has been kind of a hard go, has it not? And yet we have a record of persisting even when there was not any indication for hope, right? So we want to say hope is wonderful if we can have it, but it's not essential for us to do the work. What is essential is an understanding of what the right thing to do is, and I would say love. Having a community in which to do it. So I hope that our program can continue with those pole stars, right? This idea that we need a community and we need a clear idea of what the right thing to do is. And from that, we can work together to figure out what tools we need to do it. So thank you. Yes.
Hi, Katie.
Hi, Jim.
You seem to have left out one name in there. All the while I was teaching at Manchester, there was one name that I always associated with the Peace Studies program. And seems as if that person had the last name same as yours. Did you ever know him?
Why are you bringing up old stuff?
Because he's your dad.
Yes, yes. Yes. Yeah, you know, that came up at my job interview as well. It did. Yes.
What was his first year? When did he come to?
Ken came to Manchester in fall of 1961. Yeah. He was a kid, like 27 years old, something like that, and was still completing his PhD at the time. But yes, so he worked as a professor of philosophy, but also taught peace studies clearly and was involved in the extracurricular and the curricular life of the program. He became director of the program in 1980. Yeah, had to push Al Dieter aside. No, he didn't do that. But Al Dieter was the director of the program from, I believe, 1969 till 1980. Before that, it was Bill Shuley in political science for a little bit. But so for most of the time, Gladys Muir was history, but and then Bill Shuley, political science. But since 1970, it has almost always been, well, I would say, with the exception of just a handful of years, someone from the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. And those were not easy years in the 70s and 80s. There were pressures to maybe sideline peace studies, or it did not have the kind of institutional support that we now have. Now Manchester's Peace Studies program is all over the place. It is recognized as a signature program, but that was not always the case. And so even in years when there was no budget for peace studies, the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies was really committed to it. And so when Ken Brown, when my father retired, the department decided that they would advertise for someone who could teach philosophy and peace studies. They maintained that commitment, which departments surely didn't have to do.
Since I'm holding the microphone, I would ask your indulgence, Katy,
Okay.
if you could back up the slideshow
Okay.
to where those group pictures of different places you had gone. I think I noticed this at the Shepherd Center. I wanted to point out something. There. That.
Oh, the picture?
This lower left-hand corner, it's a little bit hard to see, but who's that gentleman clear to the left that's holding that banner?
That would be Jimmy Carter. Jimmy and Rosalind Carter.
Yeah, Rosalind's on the far right.
On the right, I think 3 times we have taken students to Jimmy Carter's Sunday school class. And each time the Carters would wait for hours as a line would go through. Anyone who wanted their picture taken with the Carters, they would greet us, and they asked us about Manchester, and each time they hold our banner. And each time it was a wonderful experience for our students, and just to hear his Sunday school lesson was pretty remarkable.
Katy, I'm interested in the Gladys Muir's reading seminar list.
Yes.
2 questions. I'm curious, how relevant is that list to now? I wonder, just in your opinion, but also, could we or could I have access to whatever you're using now as the suggested reading list? I would love to have a go at that myself.
I would be happy to compile that. It might happen after I get back from Jan term. Yes, the reading list that she offered, I mean, there are some of her books from classes that some of the readings that we still use. The amount that I require for reading has downsized. I do not require as much reading as Gladys Muir. But to be fair, in the 1980s, I was not required to read as much as Gladys Muir required of her students. But we still read Arnold Toynbee, Oswald Spengler. We still read Elton Trueblood. We still read some of these classics in philosophy of history. Some of the books in religious studies are contained in the Intro to Religious Studies courses. So I would say that there is a sampling. People do not get as, we do not require as thorough a dive into that narrow slice, in part because we are more interdisciplinary. Gladys Muir didn't have environmental studies students balancing all of their labs with their upper level philosophy classes. So as we are a more diverse program now, the readings have changed some. But I'll get you that list, Ruth.
You can just one at a time. It's fine.
I love it.
Katie, tell us about how it came about for you to now be on Bethany's board. Is it because of this collaboration with taking classes, or did you fill another spot, or?
Oh, well, I've been losing the election at annual conference for a number of years. But that's okay. I put my faith in the delegate body to know about that. But I think it's because there is such a desire on Bethany's part to maintain ties with the Church of the Brethren colleges and universities. Now, Bethany, as you know, has been on the vanguard of online really high quality hybrid, high flex instruction because of our partnerships with the church in Nigeria. So even before COVID, they had developed quality instruction for combining classes that are not physically together. And as a result, and because of the extension in Bethany's curriculum and theopoetics, there's been an increase in students who are not from the Church of the Brethren in recognizing all that Bethany has to offer. At the same time, we know that the numbers of students from the Church of the Brethren and from Church of the Brethren colleges has been decreasing. It's been fewer and fewer students who come from our schools to go to Bethany. And so I have been eager to work with Bethany at imagining how we can change that. And it's, I'll say personally, it's not just because I recognize that this is a really good opportunity for Manchester students, but it's also as someone who is a member of the Church of the Brethren, recognizing that Bethany is critical to our denominational leadership and wanting to foster all of the ways that we might build that network of new leaders in the church. So that's a couple things. So yes, there was an opening on the board, and I was asked if I would take a seat, and so I'll start my tenure on the board in the spring. Wish me luck.
I'm interested in your journey between, I'm guessing you completed your undergraduate in peace studies at Manchester,
I did.
and then your journey between that time and the time you came back to teach.
I went to the University of Notre Dame. The Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies has a master's degree in peace studies. Now it's in a global studies school, but at that point it was standalone, led by Bob Johansen. He's the one who sort of established that program at Notre Dame. And then after that year, I went to complete my PhD in a safety net program. My fallback was philosophy. Can you imagine? I got my PhD at the University of Minnesota in philosophy, and my area there was in tribal political philosophy. That was my dissertation when I did research with my mother's community in North Carolina. After completing the PhD, I thought I would be staying in the Twin Cities. My husband was an established musician there, and so I taught at a number of schools and then was tenure track at the University of Minnesota before coming back to Manchester in 2007. And I loved Minneapolis. Minneapolis is a fantastic place. But I understood then, and there was a wonderful network of peace builders and a place at the University of Minnesota that was eager to develop a social justice minor. But it was also a little bit isolating because I was in a very progressive and activist community, and I felt like I could not accomplish there what I could accomplish in a community like North Manchester, at a school like North Manchester. My connection with students was entirely different at a research institution than it is at a school that focuses mostly on the nurturing of capacities of young people and returning students. So I am very grateful that I had the opportunity to come back.
Maybe a last question anyone wants to ask Katy? Well, I know when I first saw this presentation at the Shepherd Center, I think I said to her before the presentation, well, I decided to come. I know about the Peace Studies program. And when I saw her program, wow, there was a lot of new information that I didn't realize. So that's why I asked her to come to our Seniors for Peace. So I hope each one of you learned something new that you didn't know about the Peace Studies. I think probably you have.
Can I say there's a couple more questions.
I think it was Libby Krepp's first year as Peace Studies coordinator. We invited her here to speak. And at that point, I think in the audience, there were two people who had taken courses with Gladys Muir and talked about how demanding she was. I'm curious whether, I think those are people who are no longer with us. Is anyone here who, yeah. It was really valuable to hear from, I think, those two people who had.
Monty.
Okay, Monty.
Monty. Yeah, Shirley Glade had classes with Gladys Muir. David Waz, I believe. No, had classes. So there are definitely Gladys Muir stories.
I grew up with letters from Gladys Muir to my father. So I knew who she was, and I sort of knew he was only here a year. He was a radical pacifist during the war and spent time in prison. Only 1 year at Manchester College, but he took a class from her, and the rest of his life, he got her letters that she wrote to her students. So then when I met my husband, Alan, he started talking about Gladys Muir, and I said, well, I know who that is. Anyway, I just treasure that connection.
Yeah. I got a call from a researcher in Ontario who wanted to write about Gladys Muir. And this person said, well, I don't understand why in the field of peace studies we don't hear about Gladys Muir. It seems that she is buried, like that. And there should be a recognition of her scholarship and this and that. So we set up a conference call. She wanted to talk with me about the program and about Gladys Muir and about, I have boxes of Gladys Muir. People give me Gladys Muir. Someone showed up at my office door with her dinner jacket. And I took it. It was like, yes, please, I will put this in the archives. And I thought, I have thought for a long time, this is an important research project. Someone should write this. And so I had a conference call with this scholar. And over the course of it, I thought, I will be so interested in what this person writes, because their understanding was Gladys Muir is buried because she was a woman. She's not known in the field of peace studies because she is a woman. And I think, yes, perhaps that is part of this complicated story. But more so, I think it's because she spent her life with students. She spent her life not presenting at conferences and not writing about her work in peace studies. She spent her life hosting students for tea and taking them to conferences. And that's the work that gets forgotten. That's the work that doesn't get your name attached to it. And so I think that there's a story here, but it's not what people expect it to be. The story is how we develop the kind of community that will be resilient through the worst of times. And we've been talking about that a lot this month. Right? There was a reason every homecoming we pick a peacemaker to acknowledge in the Peace Garden. There's a wall of peacemakers, and it starts with Gladys Muir and Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Those are the first names that went up to represent an international peacemaker, a national peacemaker, and then a Manchester peacemaker. And we follow that tradition. And this year, we chose Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, as our peacemaker. And it was because we thought, looking forward to this election that was going to happen the next month and not knowing what would happen with that, we knew that we needed to focus on being neighbors and what it means to be neighbors and where we find our good models for neighborliness. And so having that coming into this season of uncertainty, this season where, again, hope may be far from us, has been so helpful. Because we do not feel like the ground is just taken out from under us. We feel like we have resources to decide what we do next. And that is the tradition that Gladys Muir gave us.
She kept, as I said, my father got letters from her. She wrote to all of her former students to keep in touch with them and let them know what was happening and encourage them.
Yes.
So,
and
a continuing thing.
And indeed, I think that too, that connection of the alumni network continues to this day. You see that in every fall when alumni come back to the homecoming reception. And if you were to look at my text messages, you will see that continuing still, that we stay in touch for that reason. That takes a lot of energy and effort. And that cannot be one person's work alone. So
She kind of started that in a way, keeping in touch with former students.
yeah, she did.
Well, thank you for your questions and the presentation, Katy. Let's thank her one more time.